Thank you, Matan. Okay, so we're very lucky to have with us tonight Lieutenant Colonel Maurice Hirsch, who's an international law expert who specializes in the prosecution of terrorists, the Palestinian Authority, and international law as applied in Yehudan Shomron. There's lots to talk about you as we start today, but I think the best thing we just will be to hear from you, because there's lots to talk about. Now, we first hear what Mr. Hirsch has to say. If you have any questions, we will have time in the end to answer. So you can write it on the chat, okay? And in the end, Daniela will read the question and we'll try to answer as much as possible. So Maurice, the stage is yours. Thank you so much for coming.
Okay, that's better. Thanks, Nini, and thanks everyone for coming. I'd just like to open with a comment about Nini's introduction. The situation in Israel at the moment is not so pleasant, and that is the one little, maybe an eighth of the glass that is only full. The rest of the glass is amazingly full. We just celebrated 73 years of Israel's independence. We just celebrated 54 years of the unification of Jerusalem. Yesterday was 54 years since Rabbi Goren, one little rabbi, went into the town of Hebron and conquered the town of Hebron all by himself. We're living in amazing times, and we have challenges that we have to face all the time. But we must never forget that Israel it's just a wonder. We've had a tough year with Corona, but we're the first ones out of it. Vaccinations, unbelievable things going on in Israel. And I can only suggest that every single one of you watching at the moment, make your plans to move to Israel and as soon as possible. That's the little aliyah pitch. Sorry, I have to do that. That's part of my calling in life. So now we can move on. As Nini mentioned at the beginning, I was born in England. I grew up in London. I went to JFS. I finished my law degree, small little university, Bournemouth, nothing so great. We all know. And then I moved to Israel. I spent 20 years in the IDF legal department in all different types of positions, from being an advisor to the legal advisor for Judea and Samaria on all types of criminal and security issues, terrorism, and then prosecuting terrorists. In my last position, I was the head of the prosecution for Judea and Samaria, prosecuting terrorists day and night. That was the first part of my career. The second part of my career, I then retired just over 4 years ago, and I joined an organization called Palestinian Media Watch. If you don't already follow us, PAL Watch, P-A-L-W-A-T-C-H, PAL Watch is an organization that you should be following, not only because I work there. It's an amazing organization that really does give you an insight into, as its name suggests, we follow the Palestinian Authority, study them, see how they're passing on messages of peace or not, and whatever the case may be. Just to give you an idea of where we stand as regards our peace partners, as regards Fatah, and so on and so forth. So that's the first part. The second part is the Bitchonistim. The Bitchonistim is a new movement that started just over a year ago. Senior IDF or ex-IDF officers who are now part of this idea of explaining Israel's security needs, explaining the security situation in Israel in an easy, understandable way, so that based on our experience in the army, we can now share that experience with everyone and explain why Israel needs the Jordan Valley, why it's so important for Israel's security. Why Israel needs to maintain a presence in Judea and Samaria, in Israel's historical and ancestral homeland. All of these things are what the Bitchonistim do. Both Palestinian Media Watch and the Bitchonistim are NGOs. We survive on donations. And therefore, if anyone who's watching, before I even say anything, you might be disappointed at the end and decide not to donate. But if you feel that, that it's a good idea, then we would definitely appreciate the donations. Into the talk itself, what is going on in Israel at the moment? If you watch the news and you see everything that's going on, obviously everyone's following, and you're seeing the missiles flying overhead or flying over us from Gaza, the riots on the Temple Mount, what's going on in that little neighborhood of Jerusalem called Sheikh Jarrah, how all of these things are intertwined into each other. That's what I'm going to try and explain a little bit of that tonight, and how we got to the situation we're in, possibly a little bit as to where we're going, and then at the end we'll take the questions. So, background. The background really starts, we can go back all the way to 1995 with the idea of the Oslo Peace Accords, and we're talking about the Palestinian society that we're dealing with. We're talking about two sides of Palestinian society. One main dominant group, that was Yasser Arafat at the time, is called Fatah. The other main dominant group, which will develop over time, develop in strength, develop in capabilities, and then step into really the political arena, is Hamas. These are the two, you can't really compare them to, it's not a true comparison to the Conservative and Labour Party, but just the idea of having two separate parties that each one is fighting the other for political control. Sometimes there's a 19th century military theorist called Clausewitz. Clausewitz says that war is just the continuation of politics with violent means. The Palestinians, Hamas, and Fatah understand that perfectly. And that's what they do. They use violence as a political expediency, obviously focused against Jews most of the time, sometimes focused on each other in order to forward their political goals. So we start off with Fatah as the dominant party. In 1995, Yasser Arafat and his party win the elections. The next elections that will take place in the Palestinian Authority will take place a decade later. In 2005, Arafat dies, is replaced in elections, supposed elections for the presidency of the Palestinian Authority. He's replaced by Mahmoud Abbas. Mahmoud Abbas decides he wants new elections for the Palestinian parliament. He calls those elections in January 2006. And unfortunately for Mahmoud Abbas, he wakes up the morning after the elections and realizes that the Palestinian people don't like Fatah anymore. They're sick of Fatah. Fatah is corrupt. Fatah has got, the leaders of Fatah have all got rich at the expense of the Palestinian people. They led them into the terror war from 2000 to 2000. They've managed to gain nothing for the Palestinian people. And therefore the Palestinian people overwhelmingly voted for Hamas. Hamas is an internationally recognized terrorist organization. They cannot be part of the government. The international community refuses to fund them. So Mahmoud Abbas decides in true democratic tradition, which really does characterize the Palestinian Authority, to simply depose the Hamas government. You people will no longer be in charge. You're going to be replaced with a technocrat government, so-called. Mahmoud Abbas will then develop and change that initial government into being a Fatah government, even though they didn't win any elections. They will then take over the Palestinian Authority. And that situation will go on for about a year. Palestinian Authority, just to put it in context, controls two areas. Gaza Strip on the one hand, definitely after Israel's retreat and disengagement from the Gaza Strip in 2005. And on the other hand, the big Palestinian towns within Judea and Samaria. That's the control of the Palestinian Authority. Hamas really rules the roost in Gaza. And in the summer of 2007, Hamas will retake its control in the Gaza Strip that it democratically won. They will throw Hamas Fatah leaders off the tops of buildings, and they will establish their control. Since 2007, Fatah has controlled Judea and Samaria, or the parts of Judea and Samaria that's under their control, and Hamas has controlled the Gaza Strip. They've been fighting all the time, each one trying to persuade the other to give up power, as to why each one is the legitimate leader. None of them are really the legitimate leaders, but that's just the situation they find themselves in. periodically they will call for elections, and those elections will inevitably be cancelled, be postponed, be put off. And through that time, the frustration of Hamas will grow. Hamas sees one little light at the end of the tunnel. The Palestinian constitution says that in the event that the head of the PA chairman dies, the leader of the parliament will then take his place. So Mahmoud Abbas, they were hoping would die. The leader of the parliament was Abdelaziz Dweck. He was from Hamas. So Hamas was really hoping to take over the PA by peaceful means, Abbas dying. But then Abbas, just about 2.5 years ago, decided, I've seen that plot coming, and therefore I'm going to disperse the parliament that hadn't really functioned for 12 years anyway. And so we're in a great period for Mahmoud Abbas. He's the single dictator. Hamas have their little enclave in the Gaza Strip, and never the two shall meet. Really the next major event that will come along to change this whole paradigm, in the middle you'll have the Obama administration, very ineffective, got nowhere with forwarding any type of peace plan, was more into appeasement of the Palestinian Authority, and appeasement, as we know, never suffices the hungry devil, and therefore that program of appeasement just raised the levels of the demands of the Palestinian Authority all the way through. Suddenly in 2017, the game changes. Comes along Donald Trump and says, you know what, this idea of the Palestinians holding the entire Middle East hostage isn't acceptable. This idea of the Palestinian Authority constantly inciting violence is no longer acceptable. This idea of the Palestinian Authority paying salaries to terrorists, salaries to people who murder Jews, is no longer acceptable. All of these things that the Palestinian Authority had enjoyed for so many years, Donald Trump said these are no longer acceptable. This pushed the Palestinian Authority into a corner. Obviously, Hamas, the fundamentalists, the crazies, they were very unhappy, but they're very unhappy with everybody. And Mahmoud Abbas and his Palestinian Authority said, well, we can't work anymore with Donald Trump. His demands to stop incitement to violence, stop terrorism, stop rewarding terrorism are simply unreasonable and unacceptable. And therefore, we need to cut off all our ties. At the same time, that vacuum is filled by the European Union. The European Union in 2017, parallel almost to the Trump administration, comes out with a strategic plan for assisting the Palestinians to reach their goal of statehood. And they write in their plan in 2017, 10 years, 11 years after the last elections had been held, that the fundamental principles of this new plan is democracy. Now, how can you write that about a society that hasn't held elections for 10 years? So the European Union said that they're going to step in. They started massive funding to the Palestinian Authority, to Mahmoud Abbas, in order to rebuild, as it were, the Palestinian Parliament. They built a new building for the Palestinian Parliament. They built a new building for the Central Elections Committee. And really, they invested a lot of time and money into promoting the idea of Palestinian democracy. Now, what is that Palestinian democracy? That's what we're going to talk about immediately, because the change comes along with Biden. Biden comes in, beats Trump, and suddenly there's a new golden era for US-Palestinian relations, or at least that's what they think. Biden has already made statements that he intends to renew the funding to the Palestinian Authority that had been cut off, and that he would renew the funding to UNRWA, to the Palestinian refugee organization, and everything would be great again. He has one little sticking point with all of this, and that's obviously the Abraham Accords, the last few months of the Trump administration, really getting to peace plans and peace agreements between Israel and some of its neighbors. No longer is there an idea of it's either Israel makes peace with the Palestinians or we lose the entire region. Suddenly part of the region, part of the Arab part of the region, is willing to normalize relations with Israel, make peace with Israel, even in the absence of Palestinian agreement to make that step forward and to reach a peace agreement. No longer will the Palestinians hold everyone hostage. So Biden comes in, and there's a new age and a new era coming along. Biden has one little sticking point that really meets with the demands of the European Union from the Palestinian Authority. This is the beginning of 2021. We want elections. We need to renew the legitimacy of the Palestinian leadership. There hasn't been elections now for 15 years. Mahmoud Abbas is in his 16th year of a 4-year term. His term as president was only meant to be 4 years, optional extra 4 years. He just never went back to the vote. And so he's now, like I said, in his 16th year of a 4-year term. And Biden is pushing for elections. The EU is pushing for elections. Mahmoud Abbas needs the funding. He needs the support. He no longer wishes to be in the cold with the relations with America. And so Mahmoud Abbas decides, you know what, we're going to call elections. Great idea. Hamas is over the moon. Hamas knows that if there are elections held, they will win. They agree shockingly to every term that Mahmoud Abbas demands of them. You have to agree to national unity governments. You have to agree to having joint lists. You have to agree to changing the electoral system. Shockingly, Hamas agrees to everything. Every obstacle Abbas tried to put in their way, Hamas jumped over it, sidestepped it, agreed, because all they wanted was elections. They read the public opinion surveys of a Palestinian survey center run by Dr. Khalil Shkaki that says that in any elections coming up, Hamas will win. Everyone hates Abbas. They're sick of him. They're sick of his sons who have got rich. They're sick of his Fatah cronies who have all got rich at their expense. And that is what they're looking for. They're looking for change. Abbas already, as he sets the elections, needs to find a way out. How does he find the way out? He goes back always to plan A for the Palestinian Authority and for the Palestinians in general and their supporters. When anything doesn't go your way with internal Palestinian politics, what do? Blame Israel. It's always Israel's fault. There is nothing that Israel can do that it will never be Israel's fault. So now we have to get to this idea of the elections, and how do we plan the elections in a way that when we eventually cancel them, because obviously we're going to cancel them because we can't afford to lose, how do we then blame Israel? So the first thing that Mahmoud Abbas does is he sets the elections for the 23rd of May. Now, for those of you who are quickly looking at your calendars, the 23rd of May is a very special day in Israel. It's Shabbat. Shabbat, everything's closed. So if you set Palestinian elections on a day when everything is closed in Israel, then you're already setting Israel up for that fall that, well, how do we have elections? We're meant to have elections also in Jerusalem. And for that to happen, the elections take place in the post office. The post office needs to be open, but the post office is never open on the Shabbat. So you set the date on Shabbat. The next part of the plan is that you demand that the international community request of Israel, force Israel to agree that in these elections, all the Palestinian factions will be allowed to participate. What does that mean, Palestinian factions? It means organizations like Hamas, the internationally designated terrorist organizations. It means the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, an internationally designated terrorist organization that just under 2 years ago, exploded a bomb at a Popular Spring, murdering Rina Schnurr, a 17-year-old Israeli girl, and injuring her father and her brother. The 5 terrorists are standing trial in the military courts. I'm accompanying the family and representing them also in those proceedings. Now, when you demand that these terrorist groups be allowed to participate, you're setting Israel up for a fall again, because what's the fall? How can Israel allow terrorist groups to campaign for elections in Jerusalem, in the same city where they've murdered hundreds of people? That just doesn't work. So first you say that all of the factions must participate. Then you say that you have to have those elections in Jerusalem. So it's on Shabbat with the participation of homicidal terrorist groups. What's the chance that Israel, oh, and by the way, not only Israel in regular situation, Israel that's just going through its own election campaign for the 4th time in 2 years, what's the chance that any Israeli leader is going to say, you know what, Mahmoud Abbas, here, take Jerusalem, give it to Hamas, give it to the PFLP, let them campaign in Jerusalem, all in the name of Palestinian democracy. Mahmoud Abbas knows that the chance of that happening is 0. And that plays exactly into Mahmoud Abbas's plan of how to really cancel the elections and simply blame Israel. At the same time, Hamas is really that chomping at the bit, because they know we're going to win. And if he cancels these elections, he's stealing our ability to retake our given elected right as the representatives of the Palestinian people. Now, if this already didn't create enough of a situation, we needed just 2 or 3 more ingredients for everything to explode. The first ingredient is Ramadan. Ramadan, the holy month of Ramadan for the Muslims, it started just over a month ago. And in the run-up to Ramadan, Ramadan is traditionally a period of time where violence is more common. People are at home, people are fasting, people are just ready for that fight. And you don't really need very much in order to push them down that line. So what does Mahmoud Abbas do? Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah controls the Palestinian media. Already from the middle of March through to the beginning of April, intensifying all the time, Palestinian media suddenly starts broadcasting videos, clips of violence, of fighting with Israelis, songs like strap on your terrorist, on your suicide belt and go and blow up the Israelis. These are things that you're hearing time and time again, clips like that are played 5 and 6 times over and over again. They're played at a time of scheduling during the day when they're closer to the children's programs. And the goal is to push the kids, push the youth, push that age group into violence. And so Ramadan starts, and immediately we see the product of that incitement. We have Palestinian youth running around, Jerusalem in particular, attacking Israelis passing by, attacking Jews passing by. Friends would film the attacks and then upload the videos onto TikTok. And that would spark that spiral of copycat attacks, because everybody wants to be famous. You're on TikTok, you're getting hundreds, you're getting thousands, you're getting tens of thousands of views. Everybody wants to be that person who, following the incitement, is now attacking the Jews and putting their own individual videos onto TikTok. At the same time, Mahmoud Abbas plays on the traditional war call of the Palestinian Authority. It's been the war call since the Palestinian Authority was created. Yasser Arafat started it. The idea of 1 million martyrs marching on Jerusalem, all to save Al-Aqsa. Al-Aqsa is in danger. What is Al-Aqsa? Al-Aqsa, in truth, is one of the mosques on the Temple Mount. But the Palestinian Authority doesn't see that as such. Palestinian Authority refers to the whole of the Temple Mount as the Al-Aqsa compound. That's the golden dome, it's sitting in the middle. That's not a mosque. That's just one of the buildings. The mosque is at the southern end of the Temple Mount, closer to and overlooking the Western Wall. And in that area, Mahmoud Abbas sounds the war call. Al-Aqsa is in danger. Why is Al-Aqsa in danger? For no reason. Israel isn't changing anything on the Temple Mount. If anything, Israel is being exceptionally cooperative. Fridays are a big day during Ramadan for prayers. On the first Friday of Ramadan, there were some 70,000 Palestinians who went up to pray on the Temple Mount. And all through that period, there was great Israeli tolerance at the expense of the Jews who are very much limited to going up onto the Temple Mount, and really that is given up for the Palestinians to have their opportunity and to have the prayers. Ramadan isn't an easy month for the Muslims. It's a month of fasting from sun up to sunset. Muslims in general have 5 different prayers during the day, so it's not an easy month to get through. And Aqsa is in danger. We need to defend Al-Aqsa. Now, it wasn't enough that we have the elections and the cancellation of the elections. It's not enough that that we have Ramadan and the build-up and the violence surrounding Ramadan. We have another little event that we have to throw into this pot, which I'm sure everybody has heard about, that then stirs really the violence a little bit more. Sheikh Jarrah. What's the story with Sheikh Jarrah? Sheikh Jarrah, it depends on who you're listening to, what the narrative is. The Palestinian narrative goes like this. The evil Jews are coming to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians who live in Sheikh Jarrah as part of the general trend and policy of Israel to expel the Palestinians from all of Jerusalem and eventually take over all of Judea and Samaria and make it Palestinian free. That's the Palestinian narrative. The truth is a little bit different. The truth is very, very simple. Sheikh Jarrah is also known as the area or the neighborhood of Shimon HaTzadik. In that area, Jews who were already from 1922 and onwards, the majority, the outright majority in Jerusalem, for tens of years, by now almost 100 years, Jews owned property all over Jerusalem. Along came the end of the mandate in 1947, 1948, and along comes the Israel's War of Independence. Jordan invades Judea and Samaria, illegally occupies Judea and Samaria, and takes up half of Jerusalem. In those areas, Jews still own land. The Jews will eventually, Jordanians will eventually be thrown out in 1967, and the land that used to belong to the Jews has now been built on by the Palestinians, but there's no question that the Jews own the land. For a period of time, the Arab tenants will pay rent. In 1991, that changes. The Palestinian Authority, or already its predecessor, the PLO, has instigated what's called the Intifada, the uprising in 1987. They're following through with the violence, and they say to the residents of Sheikh Jarrah, how can you continue paying rent to the Jews? That really does give them the right to say that they're the owners of the land, which they are, and therefore you should stop paying rent. You cannot agree to Jewish ownership of any land. That's a basic fundamental idea of the Palestinian Authority. Jews cannot own land. Arabs selling land to Palestinians are punished with life imprisonment. But it's a very simple law for the Palestinian Authority. And so the Jews want their land back, or for the tenants to pay rent. Tenants refuse to pay rent, the Jews go to court, and the court orders that, well, if you're not going to pay rent as a tenant, then you get evicted. That's just part of life. It's not specific to Israel. It's not specific to the Palestinians. It's not specific to Jews. If you don't pay your rent, you get evicted. That's just what it is. And nothing is different in this case with Sheikh Jarrah. It's not a case of an Israeli policy that Israel is expelling the Palestinians. There are hundreds of families living in Sheikh Jarrah. No one is throwing that out. We're talking about specific properties that belong to specific Jews that are demanding that their tenants either pay rent or be evicted. That's the story of Sheikh Jarrah. There is no bigger story there. It's the apartheid, obviously, of the Jews that, well, if the absentee Palestinians who own land in Jerusalem cannot get their land back, so the Jews shouldn't be able to get their land back. I understand that argument. What am I talking about? I might have gone through that a little bit quickly. There are arguments of Palestinians who say that we used to live in the Jewish-controlled section of Jerusalem before 1967. Or even 1948, we fled that area during those wars. We still own those properties, and therefore we would like that property back. That's absentee properties. There is that idea. It does exist. Israel many, many years ago adopted a policy where in some circumstances that properties could be returned, but in most cases, the idea that was developed and the policy that was developed, it's found already in Supreme Court decisions from 1993, is that Jews who own properties in the Arab areas are not allowed to have them returned to them. And similarly, those absentee properties in Jerusalem are run by the absentee properties guardian, and that's the way that process works. It has nothing to do with this case. That's just the red herring when anyone claims that this is the case, because this is privately owned land, which was owned and registered all the time by the Jews. And don't let any of that extra story in any way confuse you about the basic and the fundamental ideas of Sheikh Jarrah. The Jews own the land, the tenants refuse to pay rent, and therefore they're being evicted. Specific properties in a specific place. It's not a wide policy of let's evict and ethnically cleanse the Palestinians from those areas. But nonetheless, in order to fight those eviction orders, what do? You use the traditional ideas of, well, this is anti-Semitic, this is apartheid, this is racism, this is ethnic cleansing. We throw in a little bit of Ramadan, we throw in a little bit of religion, and we have riots going on in Sheikh Jarrah as well. When you put all of those together, one on top of the other, Fatah in Jerusalem is doing a fabulous job. They are inciting violence. The crowds are following their call for violence. The crowds feel like they are defenders of Al-Aqsa, they're defenders of the Temple Mount, of Haram al-Sharif, as they call it in Arabic. And they find themselves suddenly climbing in the internal polls. So if your political rival is achieving their goals to better their position within Palestinian society, and you want to prove your credentials as the true defender of Al-Aqsa, you're Hamas sitting in Gaza, what do? The answer is very simple. You start firing rockets at Jerusalem. You start firing rockets at Bet Shemesh. Your immediate claim is that if Israel does not withdraw all of its troops from the Temple Mount, then we are going to attack because we are defenders of Al-Aqsa. Why are the police on the Temple Mount? Because the Temple Mount, I don't know how many of you have been to the Western Wall and know the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount sits up here. The Western Wall is the wall that really is 30 meters high. And when you stand on the top and you throw rocks over onto the plaza of the Western Wall, you really do endanger lives. When you shoot fireworks at policemen on the Temple Mount, you endanger lives. In order to prevent that rioting, you need policemen on the Temple Mount. It isn't nice. It isn't pleasant when there's so many prayers going on, when the Arabs are really spending the night on the Temple Mount, in the mosque itself, gathering rocks in order to throw them the next day at the policemen, in order to throw them over the wall the next morning onto the Western Wall Plaza. And we see that. For those of you, I don't know if you have Twitter and things like that, you can follow me. There's pictures that I put up there a few days ago from inside the mosques of the preparations, really defiling a sacred place of worship in order to prepare for war. That's what they were doing. And so you have Israeli policemen going in, you have the scenes of violence. Hamas are now defending the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and Hamas starts firing rockets. Hamas has had a bad time. Corona didn't do well for Hamas. Thank God, really. Hamas, because the Gaza Strip is really pretty much isolated and there aren't so many people going in and out. They didn't suffer too many attacks of Corona and too many deaths from Corona. It could have been really tremendously worse, but they're under pressure. They're under pressure to provide vaccinations. They're under pressure to stop the spread of Corona. They need people to look at something else, to have something else to talk about, to have something else to occupy them. And the best way is to fire missiles at Israel. So what do we have going on in Gaza? And we see it every time that we have a conflict with Gaza. Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, they're the two big organizations in the Gaza Strip, both terrorist organizations. They really on a regular basis commit multiple war crimes. The first of those war crimes is the fact that they hide. You have to understand a little bit of the topography of the Gaza Strip. It isn't a tremendously big area, but there are not a small amount of open areas. The civilian population and the population in general is concentrated into very small areas, predominantly along the coast. And so what Hamas does and what Palestinian Islamic Jihad does is that they hide their rocket launchers within the civilian urban areas. If you've seen any of the videos coming out of Gaza at the moment, you see these rocket launchers. Today, there was an amazing video of a Palestinian kid in the Gaza Strip filming out of his window rocket launchers, reversing up and down his street in order to find the right place to fire the missiles at Israel. So they put those missiles in the urban areas for two reasons. Firstly, they can use the civilian population as human shields. They hide the missiles behind the civilians. Secondly, really as a result of the use of the civilians, they know that Israel is somewhat deterred from attacking those rocket launchers because of the potential coincidental damage and collateral damage that will be caused. Israel is trying all the time to carry out strategic surgical attacks, just focusing on the terrorists, while the terrorists are using every opportunity to hide their weapons behind the civilians, behind UN installations, behind hospitals. I'm sure you've all heard the story of the Hamas, really, center of operations that is located under the Al-Shifra hospital, the main hospital in Gaza. That's where their main headquarters is. And they do that because they know Israel will not attack a hospital. But that's the way they work. In the last now 48 hours, Hamas has shot almost 1,200 missiles at Israel, as far north as Herzliya, Netanya area, and even towards Jerusalem. On Yom Yerushalayim, the day that marked the unification of Jerusalem and Israel's liberation of Judea and Samaria, which was just a few days ago, as I mentioned when we started. That's when the missile fire starts. They immediately fire towards Jerusalem. They know that in Jerusalem there are a lot of Jews that are gathering in order to celebrate Yom Yerushalayim, the Jerusalem Day, and they know that will have a tremendous effect. They immediately succeed in their goals. The traditional flag walk march that goes around the old city with really tens of thousands of Israeli youths walking through the streets of Jerusalem, celebrating, walking in the footsteps of the paratroopers from 1967. If you remember the historical footage that we have of Motagur going up onto the Temple Mount saying, Har Habayit Biadenu, the Temple Mount is again in our hands. And Israeli youth for the last 50 years have followed in the footsteps of the paratroopers. Immediately, that march is stopped because you can't have the march going on when there's missiles being shot at you. Hamas have immediately achieved their goals. They continue shooting on as far as possible into, they've already endangered over 1.5 million of the people just in the area of the coast where they're shooting. Never mind the whole area of Bet Shemesh that they're shooting to, and Jerusalem along the coast. Ashkelon, where I spend a lot of time in my life. Ashdod, where my daughter is now studying in a gap year in a midrashah. Going all the way along. Tel Aviv, Herzliya. That's Israel's main population centers. And they're firing missiles in order to murder as many people as possible. Israel is very lucky from 2 points of view. Firstly, our tremendous minds managed to develop Kippat Barzel, the Iron Dome system, which really shoots down 80% of the missiles that come over the Gaza Strip. I'll explain that comment in a second. And at the same time, the missiles that Hamas uses aren't particularly developed because of the maritime blockade that we've had in place since 2007. We've stopped the flow of Iranian, really more updated weapons getting into the hands of the homicidal terrorists from Hamas. A little explanation of what I just said before. Iron Dome shoots down 80% of the missiles that leave the Gaza Strip. Unfortunately for the Hamas, 1/3 of the missiles that they fire backfire and land in the Gaza Strip. A family, the Al-Masri family, father, 3 children, were killed yesterday, 2 days ago, by a missile fired by Hamas. The casualties that you're hearing, many of them, are the result of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad firing missiles that land in the Gaza Strip. It's not only Israel that's saying that, it's also human rights organizations that have already detailed those explosions and the fact that Hamas really has killed its own citizens because they're not very successful with their, unfortunately, they're too successful with the rockets because they're getting further and further every time. And so Hamas has its ultimate goal of finishing this round of violence in a better political position than it started. It started with Hamas, we're going to win the elections. They saw their downfall as Mahmoud Abbas cancelled the elections. They saw Mahmoud Abbas getting stronger and Fatah getting stronger as the defenders of Al-Aqsa. And now they retake their place, or as they see it, as the rightful place as the defenders of Al-Aqsa by trying to kill as many Jews as possible, firing missiles at as many destinations as possible into the civilian areas. We've seen, unfortunately, until now, we've had, I think it's 8 is the current death toll of Israelis who have been killed. Another soldier who was shot this morning, or was attacked this morning by anti-tank missiles being fired directly out of Gaza. Omer Tabib, Staff Sergeant Omer Tabib was the soldier who was killed this morning. And we've had direct hits on houses, which have, thank God, finished in most cases without loss of lives. True miracles that we're seeing. Straight direct hits to houses. Families were just in the bomb shelter. It's amazing things that are happening. Imagine 1,200 missiles landing on London or landing on Manchester and almost no one being killed from that. It's just unbelievable. And so into that whole pot, you need to throw one final ingredient, and that's the Palestinians trying to really garner support within Israel's Arab population. That's what we've seen in the last couple of days, riots from Israel's Arab population. We've seen 2 diametric opposites in the last couple of months. On the one hand, for those of you following Israeli politics after the last election, we're in another deadlock. Really, the kingmaker is a guy called Mansour Abbas. He's the head of the United Arab Party. He has 4 seats in the Knesset, and he is the balance of power for making a government. Mansour Abbas, for the first time, comes along. He's split off from the other Arab parties and says, you know what? Being the representative of the Palestinians in Israel has not given us anything. It hasn't forwarded our goals as the Israeli Arabs. We're getting lost. I want to come and represent not the Palestinians, Arabs who live in Israel. I want to represent the Israeli Arabs. We are our own individual identity, and we deserve our own representation. And that for part of the Arab population is just a change that they're going through. He managed to get 170,000 votes, which is no small feat. On the other hand, the other Arab parties are fundamentally, really, they fundamentally disagree with the existence of the State of Israel, and that's part of their platform to bring about the end of the State of Israel. They are the representatives of the Palestinians who want to destroy Israel, and they are the representatives, to a certain extent, also of Hamas. They are inciting the Israeli Arab population into joining this violence, into joining the idea of you are also defending Al-Aqsa. These are the Israeli Arabs who go to Ben Gurion Airport and get on a plane just like I do. They go to the Temple Mount more times than I can, because my time of going up onto the Temple Mount is restricted. Theirs is not. They can see every day that the situation on the Temple Mount hasn't changed in any way, shape or form. And yet that violence is still carrying on. That violence has turned really into a pogrom in some of Israel's cities. In Lod, last night, they were burning shuls, and they were burning cars. They were attacking passers-by, to the extent where tonight the police announced a curfew in Lod. Like, this is the city that's a 12-minute drive away from Tel Aviv. This is the city that's right next door to the airport, and suddenly there's a curfew there because of the rioting. This is all the inflammation of the whole situation, directed by the Palestinian Authority, directed by Hamas. Hamas is suddenly playing into the Israeli Arab population, because they realize, you know what, we're losing support there. That Israeli Arab population is seeing itself more integrating into Israel. I myself had not a small amount of Israeli Arabs, Muslims, volunteering for service in the IDF in ever-growing numbers. It's a change that Israel's Israeli Arab population is going through, and obviously the terrorists don't like that. They want the Israeli population, the Israeli Arab population, to feel that they are downtrodden, that they are in some way inferior, and that they need to rise up and fight. And the rallying call again is the Temple Mount. That's the background of what's going on today. It has nothing to do with anything that Israel could have done or should have done in any way, shape or form. It's internal Palestinian politics being played out, as I mentioned at the beginning, Clausewitz. War is just a continuation of politics with violent means. This is just a continuation of the internal Palestinian politics with violent means. We will end this round of violence in exactly the same place where we were. Gaza will still be controlled by Hamas. The Judea and Samaria, the Palestinian areas and towns in Judea and Samaria will continue to be controlled by Fatah and Mahmoud Abbas. There will be no democracy. There will be no elections. And in the meantime, they will have just done their best in order to each one claim their credentials as the defenders of Al-Aqsa and of, we are the true representatives of the Palestinian people, and we are the ones who are forwarding our goals. That's really what's going on. Israel's situation obviously is desperately bad, not because of the conflict with the Palestinians, but because for the last 2 years we've been incapable of forming a stable government. 4 elections in 2 years is just ridiculous, and we're again at another stalemate. Obviously, Mansour Abbas, the kingmaker, who was potentially going to join or support or externally support one of the governments, has now said that he can in no way support any government that would declare war on his people. He's taking a step back, and therefore we remain in that deadlock of no one really able to form a government, no government that can make decisions, no government that can make policies, and that's where we are, and that contributes obviously to the situation. The Biden administration seems to be almost sitting back and just enjoying seeing the Palestinians riot and shoot missiles at Israel. It's an unfortunate change in their policy, but it's something that we are experiencing. The EU, on its part, the EU is probably one of the most disastrous contributors to the situation. The EU does not see any of the responsibility of the Palestinian Authority, of Fatah, or of Hamas for the situation. They play into and play up the narrative that it's always going to be Israel's fault. We just had the special representative or the ambassador for the EU here talking about how he mourns the loss of life, obviously, but calls on Israel to show restraint. What do you mean I'm meant to show restraint? Homicidal terrorists are firing 1,200 missiles at my civilians, and I should show restraint? Why should I show restraint? It is my responsibility to defend my people. It is my responsibility to defend my country. If Europe were under such an attack, no European leader would say, well, you know what, we have to show restraint in the face of these homicidal terrorists. But for Israel to show restraint, that's always the call. The UN obviously adds in there a little bit of a bias and hatred with the special representative of the Secretary General calling on Israel also to show restraint and to ensure that the limitation of civilian casualties. He says nothing about Hamas, nothing whatsoever. All of these things embolden the terrorists. We had, unfortunately, the Dominic Raab, I'm sure you know the foreign minister, expressing his sadness about the fact that the Palestinian elections were cancelled. Well, why are you sad? What are you sad about? Are you sad about the fact that Hamas, the internationally designated terrorist organization that's now trying to murder Jews with 1,200 missiles that they're firing to the civilian population? Are you sad that they didn't win? What exactly were you thinking to yourself, Dominic Raab? That is unfortunately part of the problem, this idea of, well, if we bring democracy to these primitive people, everything will be better. Democracy will do nothing for them. Democracy will bring Hamas into the leadership, and that's not something that anyone should tolerate, and definitely not aspire to. That's where we are at the moment. Israel is in this precarious situation of being constantly attacked. Children spending nights in bomb shelters. We're getting back to that situation. My daughter on Yom Yerushalayim was in Jerusalem as the missiles were flying over our head, that's what we're living with. But this too will pass. This too will pass. Israel is strong enough and resilient enough in order to get through this. We need to, and I don't say this lightly, we need to kill as many terrorists as possible. That is our right under international law. Terrorists should be killed. That's just what it is. When they're firing missiles at you, they should be killed. That's what Israel needs to do. That is the policy that Israel has shown that it has now adopted, of strategic targeted killings of the heads of the Hamas military wings, as we saw today with a series of targeted attacks. The claim being made is that these people are civilians and that every civilian life is lost is a war crime. That's simply not true. The war crime is intentionally targeting civilians. Israel does not do that. Israel strategically strikes and surgically strikes at the terrorists. Sometimes there is collateral damage and it's unfortunate, but that's just what happens in war. Israel does everything it can to limit that damage, to limit the collateral damage, and to ensure that to the greatest extent possible, those killed are only the terrorists. But when the terrorists use the civilians as human shields, that becomes an almost impossible mission. That's what's going on in Israel today.